Today let's talk about Hellenistic Greece, and Hellenistic really refers to well, Hellenization, which is really another way of saying Greek, the coming of Greek culture to much, not only of Greece of course, but of much of what is now the Middle East, and even all the way up to India, because the reason for that is because of Alexander the Great himself. Alexander, who actually is the king for a very short number of years, between 336 and 323, he inherits the throne from his father. So he's only really around for 13 years as the king of the. He's from Macedonia, which is as you perhaps know, is an independent state today. Also, there's a part of called Macedonia, which is actually part of Greece now, and it's in southern, well, relatively southern part of Greece, actually more to the north. But in any case, that's where Alexander comes from. So Hellenistic culture is essentially what Alexander brings with him, which is much of Greek culture. And I'm talking again about philosophy and literature and the arts and so on. The result is going to be a grand mixture, really, of the Greek culture with some of the cultures in Asia. And what you end up with is Hellenistic. That is to say, one of the most thriving, one of the most dynamic cultures, not only in the ancient world, but really ever. Quite extraordinary. Well, how did all that happen? Well, a lot of it is because of Alexander himself. And so the question we can ask this time is, was Alexander really great? And I suppose the answers are going to be yes and no, because after all, he was a warrior. He brought a lot of violence in different areas. At the same time, you can look at it otherwise. You can say, well, he wasn't just an imperial master. He was bringing great ideas. He was bringing philosophy. He was bringing geography. He was bringing the notion that learning is actually important to much of the world that he conquered. Remember, he was, after all, the student of Aristotle, and scholars will debate about whether he learned very much from Aristotle or not, about the brotherhood of mankind. But certainly he took a lot of those ideas and he would apply them wherever he went. He founded cities. He brought Greek ideas, as I said, with him everywhere. He built libraries, and one of the great libraries is actually in Alexandria, the city that took his name, in northern Egypt, right on the coast of the Mediterranean. So what about Alexander? Well, again, the question, was he great? He becomes king in 336, and within a couple of years he does something that Athens had never done, and certainly Sparta had never done, nor had any Greek city-state done that. Unifies Greece. Greece becomes one, and he makes it the most powerful kingdom of the day by expanding it out. So to begin with, how does he do that? What does he do to make Greece so strong that is so different? Well, of course, he got a lot of his ideas from his father, Philip, but he also got ideas from elsewhere because his father got some of those ideas from another city-state by the name of Thebes. And what they did was, it was the way that they constructed their army. They put what's called a phalanx in the middle. By the way, the armies were still quite small. When Alexander conquers all these great areas that he does, he's only bringing an army of about 35,000 men with him. Just imagine that he's conquering all the territory all the way up to India, which is quite extraordinary, really. So he, as I said, he organizes things according to the way that he got it from his father. So in the middle, the battle would be the phalanx. And there would be something like, well, according to some, 256 men, 8 deep, could be 12 deep, it could be 10, 12, 14 across. But the whole idea was to suit them up, to give them armor, to give them pikes. These are these long kind of pole-like devices with 2 points on them. And some of them are quite long. They could be up to 18 feet long. And they would hold these in front of them. And of course, they also would have shields to protect them. These were very formidable forces. It was very, very difficult to penetrate the middle. And that's why it was very difficult to ever really push the Greeks back. You might say, why didn't others do that? Why didn't they simply copy the Greeks? Well, they did this much better than others for several reasons. For one thing, Alexander's army was a professional army. They drilled all the time. They were professionals. That's all they did. And so they really had not only training, but incredible mobility as well, because of the way things were organized. So in the middle, you've got these phalanxes, right? Almost impenetrable. On the right, heavy cavalry, well armed. And these also kind of formed in a wedge shape, and it was the cavalry that had the highly responsible duty of kind of penetrating through the forces of the enemy and then circling them. On the left usually would be allies, lighter infantry, cavalry, and their They're primarily defensive. This worked extremely well. This was the concept. These were the kinds of armies that Alexander put together to sweep those who were in front of him. The main enemy, of course, that he faced was the Persian army. The Persian army had been dominant for a very long time. The reason Alexander was facing them, if you remember, they had already been the foes of the Athenians. So it is the Persian army, Darius III in particular, the general and the leader, opposed by Alexander, and he pushes them back very quickly after he invades what's now the Middle East and then onwards into Asia, beginning in 334. He's very successful, as we already know, and so what does he do? What does he do once he has conquered this kingdom? Relatively quickly, to some extent because of the weaponry, to some extent because of the mobility, to some extent because of the professional army that he had crafted. So what does he do? Well, a number of things. He organizes cities, first of all. As I said, he organizes learning centers, such as libraries. And the library in Alexandria, by the way, was an incredible library. It had at one time more than 1 million manuscripts, if you can imagine that. Maybe not manuscripts in the way that we have books today, but nevertheless 1 million separate manuscripts. Unfortunately, there's a fire, some of that's lost, but ancient learning carried on. Really incredible. He marries a Persian. In fact, it's Roxana, and after he leaves her, he actually remarries another Persian. He incorporates Persians into his army. He integrates them. He wears, and he has his men wear Persian dress, so that the army is an integrated army. He allows people everywhere to retain their own customs. He allows them to worship in their own religions. He allows them to even keep their own kind of local laws and so on. All he insists on, they pay taxes, of course, to him, and what he really wants is to be able to take men and to recruit them into his army. So that's what he does. He builds really a kind of a unified, very much unified empire in this way, as I said, the most successful one. Let me just tell you one of the results of really because of Alexander, because it's as this culture develops, you might say it really helps sponsor and promote science, learning, philosophy, history, all the arts. And let me just use as an illustration of all this, a man by the name of Eratosthenes. He was a geographer, and he was also the head of the Alexandria Library, roughly talking around 250 years before the time of Christ. What he did is something that most of us would have difficulty doing even now. He was able not just to guess at or to speculate about the circumference of the Earth, he was able to demonstrate it mathematically, and that's, of course, he had the legacy of Greek mathematics behind him, geometry and trigonometry that he could draw upon. So here's what he did, and I would suggest that you, as a class, experiment and do this. You would have to go, of course, to Africa to do it. You'd have to go to Egypt, and then you'd have to go some 500 miles to the south. Could be done. He was able to do it because all this was part of the territory that had been conquered, and he had geographers and others who were travelers and could give him this information. On June 20th, the summer solstice, the beginning of the summer, what Eratosthenes knew was that at Alexandria, precisely at noon, the sun's shadow cast a shadow, not the sun's shadow, but the sun cast a shadow of some 7.5 degrees, right? Now remember, we live in a globe, right? And we also stand perpendicular wherever we're standing to the globe. So what he was observing was that at noon, 12 o'clock, June 20th, there was a shadow, assuming the sun's out, of course, there was a shadow of 7.5 degrees. 500 miles to the south, there was no shadow at all. And what that meant was the sun was directly over, that's the Tropic of Cancer, by the way, the sun is directly over that, and it casts no shadow at all at the same time at noon. Well, what accounts for that? Remember, the distance is 500 miles. What accounts for that, right? And keep in mind that we're talking about a globe. Well, the Greeks knew, and Eratosthenes knew, that there's 360 degrees in a circle. So if you think of the globe as a circle, then you're on the right track. Now, 7.5 degrees is the difference between being 500 miles to the south and being in Alexandria. 7.5 degrees, well, you put that over 360 degrees and you've got 1 over 48. So what you've got to do now is you multiply 500 miles, because that's the difference. You multiply 500 miles, which is the equivalent of 7.5 degrees, right? And guess what? When you multiply 500 times 48, that comes down, and I hope I'm correct, so you can let me know in an email if you want. That should come out to 24,000 miles. How about that? He was able to predict that. Some of you might say, well, wait a minute, didn't the sun's rays come in at different angles? Wouldn't that explain it? And the answer is no, and he knew that. He was able also to figure out how far the sun was, more or less, and we know that it's about 93 million miles. When you look at the rays coming from 93 million miles away, what you would know is that they're basically parallel to each other. So the fact that the sun's rays are coming in from such a distance means it's possible, not only possible, but they're going to be basically parallel. So that given, he figured out the circumference 24,000 miles. It's a little bit different than that, but that's about as close as you can get. If you could really refine the 7.5 degrees, then you'd probably have the exact amount. But, so there you go. Because of Alexander, so was he great? Well, it was because of him that you had these kinds of legacies. It was because of him that the great learning was able to spread. It's because of him that this great empire was able to endure. And by the way, the empire actually doesn't endure intact. It eventually, and very quickly after his death, becomes 3 different empires, but they remain very, very stable. One is Egypt, one is Greece, and then the third would be the area that he conquered in Asia. So there you are, Alexander. Alexander is great. Thank you.